There's a case to be made for silence, so I could just stay silent and you guys can figure it out. But I'm here to tell you 3 stories, and unless I speak, I won't be able to tell you those stories. The first story is about a friend of mine who lost her mom recently to ovarian cancer. Auntie was diagnosed about a year ago, and soon after the diagnosis, Auntie made the startling decision that she did not want to go for chemotherapy. Her family protested, her children protested, my friend pleaded with her, but Auntie did not want to deal with losing her hair. She didn't want chemo going into her veins. Sure enough, a few months later, Auntie passed away. I met my friend recently. This is several months after Auntie has passed away, and my friend is still stuck. But more than sad, she's angry with her mother. The second story is about another friend of mine. We grew up together. We went to school together. After school, I went to med school. He went to LUMS. At the fantastic campus of LUMS with the lush green romantic gardens, he fell in love with a beautiful girl in his class. And as young love often is, it was perfect, it was beautiful, she was the most beautiful girl in the world. He wanted to marry her. She wanted to marry him. Everything was perfect. He spoke to his parents. His parents decided that they would support these young people in their quest for love and lifelong happiness. And then, of course, one last piece of the puzzle was her parents. They spoke to her parents, and it was a very clear no. No chance. This boy, as handsome as he might be, did not have the future prospects that they were looking for in their future son-in-law. It was a hard no. This young love, this budding love story came to a rapid and painful end. The third story is about my son, Haroon. He's 4 years old. He loves everything about being 4 years old. He loves that he gets to play all day. He loves that he has a lot of toys. He loves his friends in school. He loves everything except for one thing, that he's the second-born child. More than anything else, Haroon wants to be the elder child, except for this one inconvenient fact that this one person who is 3 years older than him exists in the family. He is adamant that at some point in his life he is going to be older than his sister. Recently, when he turned from being 3 years old to being 4 years old, you could see his dismay when he found out that his sister inconveniently had gone on from being 6 years old to being 7 years old. This does not compute with him. Recently, he asked me what will happen when he's 72 years old. 72 is the age of his dada. And unfortunately, I had to tell him that his sister will be 75 years old at that point in time. All of these people are dealing with grief. See, we think of grief only in the context of death. But grief is there anytime there is loss. Grief is the cost we pay for love. Anytime there is an attachment, a bond, or control, and we lose it. We lose a relationship, we lose a friendship, we lose a toy, there is grief. Now, we've known for about 60 years how people deal with grief. In 1960s, some research came out about the grief cycle, how people deal with grief. People go through various emotions as they deal with grief once they are triggered. The first instantaneous reaction is denial. This cannot possibly be happening. I cannot possibly have lost my toy. We cannot possibly have lost that cricket match. Then goes anger. How is this possible? This is not fair. Then comes bargaining. Bargaining is the stories we tell. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell others about how unfair a hand we have been dealt, about how unfair it is that we are having to deal with this grief. Eventually, bargaining gives way to depression, the sadness that sets in once we realize that the loss is permanent. And if we are lucky, eventually we move on to acceptance. When we accept this new reality and we move on. Now, the grief cycle is something that they teach you in medical college also. And like most good medical students, I studied about it also and then promptly forgot about it the day after the exams. And for 20 years, it wasn't a part of my life. I came across it again 3 years ago at a course I took. It was a course about leadership. I went in expecting Excel sheets and charts, talking about performance management. But instead, we were talking about grief. We were talking about the grief cycle. And we were talking about how to deal with grief, internal and external. And within that context, I realized that the grief cycle is not something that you go through just once. For any grief, big or small, one time or ongoing, you go through this cycle again and again until you truly process the grief. You can get trapped in it. You can oscillate between the various stages until somehow you make your way through it. And the tools that I came away from this course, that there are 3 tools that you can use sometimes to help you move out, to help you break away, to achieve escape velocity out of this grief trap. They're very simple tools, very simple concepts. Gratitude, forgiveness, and finding a new bond. Gratitude for a life well lived, for having your mother in your life for 45 years before she got cancer. Gratitude for all the time that your daughter got to spend with her grandmother. Being able to find a new bond with your daughter so now you can see your mother in your daughter. Forgiveness for being young and stupid and in love when you should be focusing on getting an MBA. Forgiveness for wanting something so bad that you forgot about everything else. Forgiveness for yourself. And forgiveness for the parents of a girl who simply want what they see is best for their daughter. Gratitude for a sister who always looks out for you, who always takes care of you, who always makes sure you get a toy when she gets a toy, who always lobbies for your iPad time. Because if we deploy these tools, we can then focus on the new bonds with the daughter that my friend has, with the beautiful family, beautiful wife and children that my friend from LUMS has, that he is not focusing on. So these tools are really important, and they can really help us deal with this grief cycle that we face every day. But why are we talking about grief in a room full of entrepreneurs? I want to tell you that grief is all around us every day. I want us to stop thinking about grief as something that only people who have lost somebody in their lives deal with. We deal with grief every day. Of course, there is grief when somebody dies, but there is also grief when somebody loses a toy. There is a grief when we lose a cricket match, but there's also grief when somebody is ill. There's grief when we miss a flight, or when we run into traffic and we can't get home before the kids go to sleep. There is grief. And grief isn't big or small. Grief is grief. My grief is as important to me as your grief is to you. And the world is big enough for all of our grief. So when you think of grief and how you are processing it, and think of grief, how other people are processing it, maybe you can leave a little bit more room around you, around the people who you're dealing with. Give them a little bit more space, a little bit more time to deal with the grief that they're dealing with. Now, the thing is, this doesn't apply to just mushy stuff in families and friends. All of you lead companies, successful companies. All of you deal with deadlines and projects, innovation cycles, reports. But I want to put to you that before everything else, you deal with people. Your customers, your vendors, your supply chain, your colleagues, co-workers, everybody that you interact with are people. And the funny thing about people is people feel more and think less. People feel first and think later. So the grief cycle is as much a change cycle. There is so much literature, so much talk about change management. Change management starts with grief management. Anytime you change somebody's reporting line, anytime you move up a project deadline, anytime you give somebody a promotion or don't, anytime you give somebody a or don't, anytime any change in the workplace happens, you trigger the same grief cycle: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And if you want to lead with authenticity, if you want to lead effectively, if you want to be a high-performance leader, you don't want to just acknowledge the grief and manage it. Maybe you want to also anticipate it. And help people in your companies, around you, and your customers. Give them the space to deal with it, to manage it. Once you do that, you will see that you have a much better understanding of not just what people are doing today, but what they might do tomorrow. Thank you.